The Flower Shop Block of the Month August Flowers. How to sew the crossover bag. This is part of the Flower Shop Block of the Month, which is a series of 12 panels with instructions for each. Cutting out. First, open up the panel that's in your kit and you can see that all the different pieces on the panel are labelled. There's the formal flower arrangement and a more informal flower display that you can choose from to put on the front of your bag. There's extra charm squares on there and all the pieces for the outside of the bag, as well as all the lining pieces as well, and a couple of gift tags for you. So carefully cut out all of the pieces. Choose which flower you want on the front of your bag and cut it so that it's in a 10.5-inch square with the design placed centrally. Then cut out all the other pieces from the panel, remembering to pin the relevant label to the top edge of each so that you don't forget which is which during assembly. Put them all to one side and keep them carefully in one place, and then you can just take them as you need them whilst you're making your bag. Making the strap and tabs. Fold one strap tab in half lengthways with wrong sides facing so that the two long ends meet and the raw edges are matching, then pin together. Sew together down the length. Once that's done, fold it so that the seam is running down the centre and press it open. Turn it right sides out so the seam lies running down the centre of the back edge. Then top stitch down both long edges. Now take one of the D-rings and fold the strap round it so the right sides are right sides out. Pin it together with raw edges matching and tack together along the edge. You've now got your strap tab with D-ring attached. Repeat that to make the other strap tab in exactly the same way. To make the strap, take the strap piece of fabric and fold the short ends over by 1/4 inch. If you measure 1/2 inch from both ends and mark these with a pin, then if you fold the raw edge to meet up with these pins, you've then got it folded over accurately by 1/4 inch. Press that in place to hold. And then repeat that at the other short end of the strap. Now fold the strap in half with right sides facing, and pin together, making sure those turned under edges stay turned under. And then pin it together all the way along so that you're matching raw edges and the strap is right sides facing. Pin it together all the way along this long edge, and then at the end, again, making sure those turned under edges stay turned under and that you sew over them. Now press the seam open. The easiest way to do this is to lay it across the centre and press it open all the way along. Those short ends have been stitched so they stay turned under. Now turn the strap right sides out. The easiest way to do this is to use a turning tube. You can buy these in sets, and it's a much quicker way of turning it right sides out. So push the tube all the way down to the end of the strap. I've tacked it together across the short end because it just makes this easier to turn right sides. Now get the stick, the straight end, not the pointed end, and push it all the way through so that you are pushing the strap through the tube. It's quite a long strap, so this is the easiest way to do it. If you don't have a turning tube, you'll just have to carefully turn it right sides out. So just work slowly and carefully all the way along the tube. You'll just have to adjust the gathers as you go along. And if you push it all the way through, then the end of the strap will come out the other end of the tube, and the whole strap is now turned right sides out. Remove the tacking stitches and take the stick out of the end. Now making sure those short ends that you folded under stay turned under, because sometimes they can move a little bit. Press it so that the seam lays down the centre of the back edge. This means the seam is less obvious when you're using the strap and you don't get the bulk of it lying on the sides. It's better to have it laying on the back edge. So press it all the way along and top stitch down both long edges like this. This just holds the strap together neatly and also adds a little decoration. Making the pocket. The pocket can be placed in the lining or the outer, but let's start by marking the pocket. So on the wrong side of the pocket, at the top short edge, take your ruler and measure and mark 2 1/4 inches down from the top short edge. And draw a line using an erasable pen all the way along. Now mark another line 1/4 inch down from that, and another line 1/4 inch down from that, so that you have 3 lines drawn across the top of your pocket. Now fold your pocket in half just to find the centre point. And measure 3 1/2 inches to the right of this and 3 1/2 inches to the left. That means that you've marked your pocket so that it's 7 inches long and it's placed centrally. By marking from the centre, it's much easier to make sure that it's central. So you're marking short lines across those 3 long lines that you've drawn so that it's 7 inches long. Now also mark diagonal lines from the outer corners of that box. Just little short lines like this. So the outer lines are your sewing lines and the inner line and the diagonal lines are your cutting lines. Now take your bag lining or your bag outer, depending on where you want to put your pocket. It's done in exactly the same way. I'm using the bag lining because I want my pocket on the inside of my bag for this one. Making sure the pocket is centrally placed across and matching the raw short edges across the top. Place it in. To be certain that it's centrally placed, you can either fold them in half or you can just measure it either end. It's about 3/4 inch. Once you're happy that it's centrally placed, pin it together all the way around outside the drawn lines because you want to sew along them and it's easier to keep the pins in place while you're sewing. So just make sure you place them outside. It's just to hold the pocket to the lining or the outer, wherever you're putting it. So you can see that the outer lines are the sewing lines and the inner line and the diagonal lines are the cutting lines. So sew together all the way around the outer lines of the drawn box. Once that's done, you can cut along the inner line and the diagonal lines so that you can create the opening for your pocket. So take all the pins out before you do this and then cut along that central line only through both layers of fabric. Once you've done that, press all of these seams open and flat. Now post the pocket through. So I've posted the outer through the pocket. You can do it either way, either the pocket through the outer or the outer through the pocket. Now you've got to rearrange these so everything is laying nice and flat. Because you press those seams open, you'll find this easier to do. The best way to do it is to match up the raw edges again and pull them slightly. By snipping those little diagonal lines, that will help the edges of the pocket to lay flat. So match up the raw edges across the top. Give the sides a little tug so everything's lying nice and flat. And then press it. It'll take a little bit of arranging, but it's worth taking the time here because what you're aiming for is for the seam that you've just sewn around the edge of the pocket to lay right on the edge. So if you just roll it between your fingers like this, then it will lay nice and neatly on the edge. Give it a press and then roll the top seam over, making sure that it's laying nice and flat and that the seam is lying right on the edge. So I've turned it over, you can see on both sides that seam's lying on the edge nice and flat. Now we're going to put the zip into place. The zip teeth need to lay centrally underneath that little pocket opening. Now you can either pin this into place and stitch it, or you can use a fabric glue. Using a fabric glue is a lot quicker, but if you haven't got that, then just use pins. So to do this, I prefer to glue the fabric, but you can glue the zip or the fabric. Put little dots of glue spread all around, just around the inside of the pocket, on the pocket side, not the outer side. Then turn it over and place it over the zip, making sure those zip teeth run centrally through the centre of that little pocket opening. You need to move the zip slider out of the way at this point. Move it near the centre so you don't sew it's not caught in the edge. And then press it down, or you can pin it in place if you prefer. Now top stitch all the way around the edge of that opening, close to the edge. You might need to move the slider out of the way when you reach it, and then you've got a neatly inserted zip. Turn it over and you now need to trim the ends of the zip to about 1/2 inch outside the stitching. You don't want to have them so that they're sewn into the edges of the pocket because it just adds bulk. So if you just trim the ends off just within the edges of the pocket, that's fine. Now to form the pocket, take the bottom of the pocket, fold it so it's right sides facing, so that the top raw edges meet and the side edges meet. Now pin the side edges of the pocket together. Just pin the pocket edges together. Don't pin it into the lining or the outer fabric, whichever one you've used. Just the pocket edges, because you're not going to sew this onto the outer fabric. You're just going to sew the pocket together. So pin the side edges together. Make sure the top raw edges match to start with. Pin those together. And then pin it together all the way along, matching raw edges again, making sure you only pin the 2 layers of pocket together. Now sew it together down either side, making sure you don't sew it into the outer part. And once that's done, tack the 3 layers together across the top. So you can see here the pocket is hanging free. You won't see any stitching from the outside. And then the top is all tacked together just to hold it in place. And now you've got a neatly inserted pocket in either your lining or your bag outer. Making the bag outer. Place the front outer, back outer, base gusset outer and 2 side gusset outers right side up on top of the wadding and press in place, adding quilting details if you want. Then trim the edge of the wadding level with the edges of the straps and all the other pieces. Now place the base gusset outer and 1 side gusset outer right sides facing and pin together across the short end. You need to stitch these together, but starting and stopping stitching 1/4 inch from the ends. So I've stitched these here. You can see I've started and stopped, finished 1/4 inch from the ends. This makes joining the front on a lot neater. Join the other side gusset outer to the other end of the base gusset outer to make 1 long gusset strip. Now take the front outer of the bag and place the side gusset outer right sides facing down the right hand side. Matching the raw edges at the top and the sides, pin it into place. Pin it into place at the top end and then at the bottom end. If you fold those seams so they're open, the bottom seam should match, the bottom edge of the seam allowance should match with the bottom edge of the bag. You can see here, if you open it up, Pin those seams open because it's easier to stitch it because you can see where you're going, and then pin it into place all the way along. Make sure that the raw edges match because you've got the extra layer of wadding. It's important that you check they match. If you've used fusible wadding, it'll be just pressed in place. If you've used non-fusible, you'll have tacked it. Now sew all the way down the side and stop stitching exactly on that seam. So here I've stitched it in place and you can see that the last 1/4 inch is left unstitched. So fold it round to the bottom of the front outer. Again, open up that seam allowance and the edge of the seam will match with the right hand edge of the bottom edge of the front outer. Pin that seam into place. Now fold that open. Now because you've left that 1/4 inch unstitched, this will open out into a nice neat corner. If you don't leave that unstitched, you don't get that nice neat opening corner, and this makes the corners of your bag a lot crisper and they will lie flatter. It's best to sew one side and then stop, then pin and sew the other side, rather than trying to do the whole thing in one go. So pin it into place again, make sure you match the raw edges. Now stitch all the way from one end to the other end, but again stop stitching and reverse stitch right on that seam. Once that's done and you've attached the bottom edge in place, you can then fold it round and attach the other side gusset to the left hand side of the front outer. Pin it into place at the top edge, then go back to the bottom edge, open out that seam, and you see it forms a nice neat right angle. Match the raw edges and pin it into place. And then put another couple of pins in, make sure those raw edges are matching. Then sew it into place, working from the bottom all the way to the top. Now you've got the gusset attached to the front of the bag. And you've got nice neat corners because of those 1/4 inches left unstitched. Take the back outer and place the side gusset right sides facing on top and pin it into place. The back outer is sewn to the other side of the gusset in exactly the same way. Make sure that you have the gusset on top, not the back outer on top, because then you can see where you're stopping and starting, because you need to have those seams pinned open. So fold the seam open, match up the seam allowance of the edge of the seam with the base of the back outer and pin it into place. Because you've got the wadding in here, you might find it easier to pin both seam allowances flat, and then you can then stop stitching at exactly on that seam. When you've got the extra bulk of the wadding, it does help to pin both seam allowances open at this stage. So starting from the top, sew down to the bottom, take it out from under the machine and sew the base along. This is exactly the same way as you attach the gusset to the front. Stop stitching at the bottom, then repin and stitch the side gusset into place all the way at the top. Now you've finished the outer of the bag. So turn it right sides out and push out all those corners. It's much easier to do this before you construct the whole bag, but you can see you've got nice, neat, sharp corners. So push those out. You can take all these labels off because you won't need them now. And that's the outer of your bag finished. Attaching the strap tabs. Take the bag outer that you've just made, and with the front outer on top, measure 1/2 inch inwards from that side gusset seam on the top raw edge of the front outer and mark it with the pin. Now take one of the strap tabs with D-rings attached that you made earlier and measure 1/2 inch down from the top raw edges. This is going to be poking out above the top of the bag and makes the strap tab more secure. So now place that so that the left side edge of the strap tab meets up with that pin and then the top of it pokes out 1/2 inch above which you marked, and then tack it into place. Now turn the bag outer over so that you've got the back right sides up, and again measure 1/2 inch inwards from that side gusset seam on the top edge and mark it with a pin. Take your other strap tab with D-rings attached and measure 1/2 inch down from the top and pop a pin in that place. Then place the left hand side of the strap tab so it's level with the pin on the back outer and so that the top of the strap tab sticks out above by 1/2 inch. And then tack it into place. I've also put a line of tacking a little bit further down just to hold the strap tabs straight during assembly. Adding the magnetic snap closure. Take the front lining and place it right sides up. To find the centre point of the top edge, fold it in half and just crease that to find the centre point. And take your tape measure you're going to place the male part of the magnetic snap on here. So take your tape measure and measure and mark 1 1/4 inches down from the top at the centre and mark with a cross where those points meet. Now place the back plate so that that cross is in the centre circle and then draw through the vertical slits. You can see here that there's the centre cross and you draw through the vertical slits. You now need to cut these slits. The easiest way to do this is with a seam ripper. Poke the seam ripper at one end of the drawn slit and then make a little cut all the way to the top end. You can use scissors, but a seam ripper is ideal for this. Now take a piece of wadding, about a 1 1/2 inch square is just right. This will just reinforce the magnetic closure. Place the back plate centrally on top and draw through those vertical slits and cut along them in the same way as you did when you cut the fabric. Now take the male part of the magnetic clasp and push the prongs through the cut slits on the front lining. Turn it over so the prongs are sitting facing upwards and push the wadding on top through those slits, then put the back plate on top, put the prongs over the slits and fold the prongs over. The wadding will reinforce it and make the snap a little bit stronger. So that's the male part attached. Now take the back lining. If you've attached the pocket into here, you'll see that the zip pocket's there. In the same way as you did with the front lining, fold it in half to find the centre point and make a crease. Just mark that with a pen. Then measure again 1 1/4 inches down and mark across where those 2 points meet. We're now going to attach the female part of the clasp there. So take the back plate that comes with that, place it so the hole is over the cross and draw through the vertical slits. Cut through these using a seam ripper. You've got to go through all the layers of the pocket if you've attached the pocket here. So just make sure that you've poked all the way through and that you cut through all the layers. The seam ripper will be fine to do this. Again, take your 1 1/2 inch square of wadding, place the back plate centrally on top and draw through the vertical slits. Take your seam ripper and cut along them. Now take your female part of the magnetic clasp, push the prongs through the slits that you've cut and turn it over to the wrong side. Place the wadding over the prongs and then place the black back plate over the prongs and fold the prongs over. You've now attached the female part of the clasp. So you can now see if you place the two together, because you've marked and measured accurately, they will sit together and match up perfectly when you come to construct your bag. Making the lining. Take the side gusset linings and the base gusset lining and join them together to make one long gusset lining strip in the same way as you did with the outer. Place the bottom of one side gusset with the top of of the base gusset and pin them together along the short ends. Then you need to start and stop stitching 1/4 of an inch from either end. Mark these 1/4 of an inch points into place. It's easier to do with the lining because you haven't got any wadding attached, and stitch together between these 2 points so that you've got 1/4 of an inch left unstitched. Take the other side gusset lining and pin that to the other end of the base gusset lining, right sides facing, matching the short edges. Again, measure and mark 1/4 of an inch down from the top and up from the bottom and stitch together between these 2 marks. So that's your long gusset lining strip finished. Press the seams open. Now take the front lining and pin the side gusset lining right sides facing down the right hand edge. Start at the top with a pin and then pin it together at the bottom. You can see here that you match the edge of the seam allowance to the bottom edge of the bag in exactly the same way as you did with the outer. It's a lot easier to see with the lining because the wadding's not in the way. And then pin it together along the length to make sure that the raw edges are matching. Start stitching at the top, stop at that seam, then pin the bottom into place and then pin up the other side. So you're sewing it into place in the same way as you did with the outer. Now you can attach the back lining to the other side of the gusset. You can see with this was the one that I put the pocket in. So pin the side gusset down so the side gusset is uppermost. They're right sides facing, but with the side gusset uppermost. Open up the seam allowances so the bottom edge of the seam allowances meets the bottom of the back lining and pin it into place. And then pin it together along the edge, making sure those raw edges are all matching. Make sure the pocket is out of the way and you don't catch it in the line when you're sewing this seam. Sew from the top and stop at that point. Now to sew the base into place, this is done in the same way, but we need to leave a turning gap in the base because this is where you're going to turn the bag right sides out when it's finished. So again, pin the other end of the seam into place and pin it along the edges. You're going to open out that corner so that it forms a nice neat right angle and then pin it into place in the centre as well. Now you need to leave a 4-inch gap unstitched in the centre. So if you measure along the length, place a pin in the centre. Then if you mark 2 inches either side of this central pin, that will be the 4-inch gap. Place vertical pins at this point because it helps to remind you to start and stop stitching. So stitch from one end, stop at the pin, leave that gap unstitched, start at that pin and stitch to the other corner. Then you can stitch the gusset up the other side. So you can see here I've stitched it all the way round. There's the gap left unstitched and I've pressed all the seams open. So your lining is now finished. Assembling the bag. Place the bag outer inside the bag lining so that they are right sides facing. Now you need to match up all the side seams where the gusset is joined on. To get a really neat finish, make sure they match up exactly. Now the easiest way to do them is place them right sides facing, open up the seam allowances and hold them flat with your fingers. And then push a pin through one seam allowance on the lining and into the seam allowance on the outer. If you push a pin right through the two, you know they match exactly. Holding that pin in place, place a horizontal pin across the two, then you can remove that and you know they're staying together and they actually meet up. Do that with the other side of the side gusset seam. Again, push the pin through the seam and then through the seam on the other side. Holding that pin in place, put a horizontal pin and then you can remove that vertical pin. Turn it round and match up the side gusset seams on the outer lining in exactly the same way. You can see here that the strap tabs are poking up beyond the edge because we placed them like that earlier. It just makes them stronger and less likely to pull out when you construct the whole bag because the extra fabric stops the fabric threads from pulling out. Once you've matched up all those side seams, then pin it together all the way along. Make sure everything's lying nice and flat and that those strap tab ends are still facing upwards. Match up the raw edges and make sure that the pocket and the lining and the wadding and the outer are all laying flat. And pin it together all around one side and then along the other side. Now sew it into place all the way around the top edge. Once that's done, it will look like this and you've joined the outer to the lining. Now pull the outer and the lining apart, so the outer's on one side and the lining's on the other. Put your hand inside the turning gap that you left at the bottom of the lining, grab hold of the end of the outer and pull the whole bag right sides out through that turning gap. Now put your hand back inside the turning gap just to push out the corners of the outer so that they lie nice and flat. And open up the edges of the lining. You now need to sew the turning gap closed. So making sure the edges of the turning gap are still folded inwards, pin it together along the edge. You can either slip stitch this closed by hand or you can just machine stitch across the top, just very close to the edge. So it will look like this and the turning gap is closed. Now push the lining inside the outer. Put your hands inside, making sure the bottom corners of the lining meet up with the bottom corners of the outer. The extra row of tacking stitches that you placed to make sure the strap tabs stayed straight during assembly, you can remove these now, because the strap tabs need to be facing upwards when you sew the bag together across the top. So just remove the tacking stitches and pull out any loose threads so that it's facing upwards, and then go to the strap tab on the other side. Remove that second row of tacking stitches. If you've used a nice long tacking stitch, these are fairly easy to remove. Now the seam that joins the outer to the lining needs to lay right on the top edge. So again, push the lining inside, making sure it's right at the bottom, and roll that seam between your fingers so that the seam is laying right on the edge, and give it a press. And work all the way around the top of the edge of the bag in the same way, making sure the seam lays right on the edge so that the lining isn't coming out, showing from the outside. And do this all the way along, again making sure those strap tabs are facing upwards. Now once you've pressed it all the way around, you can top stitch all the way around the top edge. So this holds the lining neatly inside and also adds a little decorative edge to the top of the bag too. Attaching the strap. So take your strap and thread one end of it through one of the D-rings so that it overlaps by 1.5 inches on the inside of the strap. Make sure that the seams of the strap are facing each other, so the strap is wrong sides facing. If you measure 1.5 inches up from the short end, then fold it over so that that pin lies on the D-ring, then pin it into place at the bottom of the strap. Then you've got 1.5 inch overlap. And you can see the strap is wrong sides facing. Pin it together close to the D-ring as well. Now stitch together in a square with a cross through the centre for added strength. Once that's done, that end of the strap is now firmly attached to the D-ring. So take the strap and pull it through your fingers, making sure that it isn't twisted. Thread the other end of the strap up through one side of the slider buckle and down through the other so that it's going over the centre bar. Now thread the other short end through the other D-ring, working from the outside to the inside like this. So it goes from the outside to the inside. Make sure it doesn't get twisted. Now you need to thread it through the slider buckle. So pull the strap that's through it out of the way a little bit into a loop and then thread it through the slider buckle, but from the top to the bottom. So thread it down through the centre bar from the top, and then back up through the centre bar like this from the bottom. So you can see that loop of the strap there, and you can see how that is attached round the centre bar. Now you're going to sew the strap ends again so they are 1.5 inches overlapped. So measure 1.5 inches up from the short end of the strap and just pop a pin in there. You can then pull that through so that pin lays on the centre bar of the buckle and then pin it into place at the bottom. So you've got a 1.5 inch overlap. And you can see how it's all joined together in a loop like this. So just double check that against yours. So you can see that all of those loops are in the same place. Now to sew into place, it's a little bit easier if you move the strap loop out of the way. Sew it into place with a rectangle or a square with a cross through the centre to make it extra strong. You can now adjust the strap through the slider buckle to make it the right length for you. By having the strap tabs on either side, it helps it to lay flat across your body. So your bag is now finished and ready to take out and show off.